survey from News Poll. Is that right, Matt?
Well, the main...
too. Yeah, sorry, Matt, but put her on notice. Is that right?
Well, the main readership survey during my period came from Morgan, and I think that the role of the research manager was characterised by being basically an infantry person put up to battle Morgan. But there were quite a lot of more tactical research projects, many of which would have gone to Newspol. Not so much, generally for the organisation, not so much for the Australian.
Heather, in your time?
In my time, we did some tests because we wanted to find out what the difference would be between doing the Australian, and particularly looking at the Australian, if you could do a national survey on the telephone. Yeah, you could. Which has subsequently, a long time afterwards, and we're talking, we did these tests a long time. They weren't numbers that went into the public arena or anything like that, but we did do tests to see what different methodologies would do as a publisher, so that we could go back and talk to Roy Morgan about our concerns, so about some things. And so yes, Newspol has did some tests for us. Yes.
Okay.
So Sol helped me with some of those things.
Yep.
Quite a bit of a question.
Yep.
Mike phone here. 2 points. Can we take those figures, circulation figures? They're obviously bread and butter newspapers. They compete. What is the accuracy of those claims? And also, talking the political level, mainstreams are politics really poll-driven, or is it a bit of mischievous, wishful thinking? I wonder whether some people are telling the truth how they're going to vote, and are the papers and media egging on politics, or is it mischievous? I don't know how it works. Is it some sort of symbiotic fusion that I'm not aware of?
I'll rule the second one a little bit beyond our remit.
Okay.
The first one, the simple answer is that there's a difference between circulation figures, which are readership figures, circulation figures and readership figures. And what members of the panel have been talking about have been largely readership figures rather than circulation figures, but there is always a question when the readership figures come out and are out of sync with changes in the circulation figures. That's been the...
There's kind of this elastic number, which is the relationship between the two, which we call readers per copy, or RPC, and it's not always a consistent number, and a very, very small change in the readers per copy from, say, 3.621 to 3.623 can cause basically the readership to go one way while the circulation goes the other way. And that usually involves the editor belting the research manager and saying, this is not possible.
Well,
readership's historical too. It comes out well after the event,
yep.
And readership can also suggest that circulations are maybe overstated. There are two separate audits, if you like, of performance.
The Audit Bureau of Circulation has now adopted a scheme from some years back in which there are about 5 or 6 measures of circulation, depending on from hard copy and stuff given away at airports right through to people downloading through subscription or otherwise. A circulation manager or research manager who's told that the difference between 3.21 readers per copy and 3.23 is really something that we ought to be thinking about. Anyone who takes that seriously shouldn't be in the job. Those figures are completely meaningless.
I assume it's been the case for everyone's experience, but the readers per copy for the Australian traditionally, compared to other mainstream newspapers, is going to be high because it's got this business focus and it has a high proportion, at least probably these days it's all electronic, but in my day, high proportion of copies went to offices, and office delivery meant a very high readers per copy because there was, much more exposure to eyeballs than a copy that just went to a household. So traditionally, when it came to readers per copy, the Australians, as would be true for the Fin Review, but the Australians done very well compared to expect for what's now at the tabloids.
But the thing with readers per copy, with readership, it's a different measure, and like circulation is the number of copies sold. And certain publications, as Matt said, the Australian, have more readers per copy who actually read it. And from an advertising point of view, it's the number of readers that are exposed to the ads. So it is important to measure readership that is different to circulation. It's a very valid measure, and it's the one probably more relevant to advertisers. The debate that we always had with Morgan is when that relationship wasn't a constant, but one time it would be high and another time it would be low, and it didn't make sense.
That's right.
But readership is the more important statistic.
But readership doesn't mean anything unless you go to Heather's disaggregated notion of what part of the paper they're actually reading.
I would agree with that. It's readership's who and circulation's how many. It does tell you who.
But it doesn't tell you what they're actually reading. I mean,
No,
it's not to say what is in readership,
but
what they're reading.
in the advertising world, like with television, what advertisers are buying is a potential audience.
Yes.
That doesn't really tell them whether they saw the ad or not.
I'm a hard-headed advertiser, and I want to know whether people read the Australian when they say they read the paper, they'll read the front page, or they turn to page 5 where my ad is.
But most people do get moved through the paper, and the thing about readership is that it's measuring a potential audience, as television measures a potential audience per quarter hour, as radio measures a potential audience per quarter hour. So if you're comparing the media, that is the relevant figure.
On television now you can get it per second, and it's not potential.
Readers per copy also.
Well, it is still potential.
Well, we're not quite perfectly sure they're watching, but it's closer than the...
and well, he was sure that the meter was on.
I was just going to mention that
I want to know whether your ad's read. Now it's not within the reader section.
readers per copy varies according to the kind of reader as well. So in the pre-internet era, a very important aspect of what was happening for the Australian on different days were the sections. You know, there's a medical section, aviation, higher ed, and one of the really big ones in those days was the IT section, which was Tuesdays. And the interesting thing is that you could see that the different kinds of readers, even though they in most cases going to an office environment, had a different propensity to share it. So the IT, which was just huge, the IT group, and from, you know, I can't remember the numbers, was tens of thousands of people who basically, this was the one buy on the Tuesday, were not big sharers of their one copy. So it didn't actually give us a great readers per copy. The higher ed section is quite the opposite. As we know, academics are two mean, one Australian, and it would cover most of a university campus.
Well, yes, sorry, one more last question.
I just wanted to revive Bridget's question about the differences in geographical circulation in the Australia.
That's right. You didn't get an
sorry,
answer.
I didn't
Quite
get to
right.
answer that. Sorry about that.
Wisdom used to be that it sold better in the outer states, which didn't have quality papers. Has that changed recently with the recent yuckification of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age?
Is that a technical term?
It still does, because most of the population is on the eastern seaboard. Frankly, it does most of its audience is on the eastern seaboard. It has a disproportionately high readership in Canberra, which is to be expected. Of the eastern seaboard, proportionately, it actually does a lot higher in Queensland, and it always has. It's always been a very strong paper in Queensland. And you know, it does relatively strongly in, you know, it's kind of the relativities. It's always struggled in Victoria. It still has a very large audience in Victoria, but it's been a market that it's found harder. But that's kind of been changing. So maybe the yuckification of the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald might be coming into play. Your words, not mine. But that the changes with the Fairfax titles have been happening for some time. It's the changes, a lot of the changes there, a lot of their readership and audience came very much from their weekends in particular, came a lot from their classifieds, and that has changed the nature of the audience of their papers, and that has changed things somewhat. I mean, that's been going on for quite some time.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Sol. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Murray.
And a special thanks to Terry, who put an enormous amount of work bringing the panel together and talking to them before they reached where they are now. And I thank you too for your indulgence. It's 11 minutes into your afternoon tea time if he ever goes to. Thank you very much.
Discussion, debate, democracy. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs channel.
Our next paper is being delivered by Andrew Dodd and Matthew Ricketson.
Thank you, Margaret. Okay. The news media is a powerful institution in a democratic society, and just as it rightly claims the fourth estate role of scrutinising those in positions of power and authority, so it too needs to be subjected to scrutiny. However, this task poses particular challenges for a media outlet because it requires even-handed treatment of commercial rivals, as well as, from time to time, criticism of itself. In the case of a publicly funded broadcaster such as the ABC, the media proprietor, so to speak, is the government. The daily task of reporting on those who control the ABC's budget has created all sorts of tensions throughout the national broadcaster's history, from its origins in 1932 under the Lyons government right up to its current wranglings with the Abbott government. Nor do governments enjoy providing money to be criticised. To paraphrase George Orwell's Animal Farm, all governments loathe the ABC equally, but some governments loathe it more equally than others. This paper is written by a former reporter for the Media Supplement and founding presenter of the Media Report, along with a former media and communications editor for The Age and past contributor to the Australian's Media Supplement. So we know firsthand the peculiarities of reporting on the media. It seems to us simultaneously the easiest and the hardest job in the industry. You have a ready-made contact book the moment you start, beginning with those sitting around you in the newsroom, but you are routinely required to ask hard questions of your boss and to pass judgment on the work of colleagues and competitors alike. You need to interview people who know all the reporting tactics you might be using, while being acutely aware of the power of public revelation. Of course, some media reporters are untroubled by these conflicting demands, doing their master's bidding by sinking their fangs into any target at which they are directed, while closing their eyes to all but the most egregious practices within their own company. The attitude here seems to be all's fun in love and media war. The trouble with this approach is that it profoundly misleads, if not deceives, the audience, who are, if you remember, the party the news media is pledged to serve. We prefer to think of it about it this way. It's commonly said that the mark of a civilised country is how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. And in much the same way, it could be said that the mark of a robust media system is how it treats its own industry. The 50th anniversary of the Australian offers a rich history through which to examine the two themes that are pursued in this paper. First, how has the Australian reported its rivals? Fairly, or has it abused its power by unfairly criticising its competitors? Second, is the newspaper capable of rising above self-interest to achieve fair criticism of itself and its parent company? I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks. So what I'll do now is run through some of the history and bring us up to date on where we're at the moment. Let me go back to 1999. The Australian's Media Supplement amounted to a significant investment. It was established in early 1999 under the guidance of Shelley Gare, who consulted to News Limited and did much of the early scoping and hiring, along with the first editor of the section, Elliot Taylor. It was designed to cater for readers interested in the constantly changing media landscape, and for readers and for many professionals active in the fields of journalism, marketing and public relations, as well as interested general readers. The business model was founded on display advertising for media recruitment, which gave the section an impetus to become a focal point for those seeking employment in the media, as well as those inside media companies who were offering the positions. So in other words, it became something of a community of interest, to which it was hoped people would come back week after week. The advertising then would make sense. It would be something that would attract readers, and readers would enter the discourse of media issues. However, it was never explicitly said that this was about influencing the discourse on a national level or about driving agendas. So what we've done to assess the development of the Australian's media section was look at issues from the third week of May from the years 1999, 2004, 2009 and this year, conveniently 5 years apart, spanning the last 15 years. And they show how a 32-page tabloid lift-out has been reduced over time to a 3-page broadsheet inserted within the business section. This is the first one we're looking at. This is in May 1999, just a couple or 3 or 4 weeks after the first edition. So by now it had found its feet and was going full steam ahead. As you can see, a tabloid, interestingly, talking about tabloids a moment ago, it was designed in such a way as to insert itself inside the paper and immediately visually different to the section as we know it today. There were 14 pages dedicated to TV listings, and then the cover story spilt off page 1 onto page 2 and 3, and you can see this one's about the head of the CNN business, Ted Turner. Great example of how in its early days the section was very happy to cover international issues and gave lots of space to international stories. The diary section was then contained on page 5, then under the guidance of Jonathan Est, he held the diary for the first few weeks, and Errol Simper then had his column on page 4, and you'll see in a moment how Errol's column has morphed into a format along with another columnist who we're very lucky to have with us today, Mark Day, and they've occupied a format that has been a real stalwart of the paper for many years. There was lots of room in the early days for long features. 1,500-word features were standard fare, and they covered a wide range of issues, and at 32 pages there was lots of space. This is one I happened to write. It was about Channel 31 and how it was developing and progressing in Melbourne. It was a distinctly non-commercial story. It was about a fairly esoteric topic, but we were given lots of space in those early days to write those kinds of stories. And then there was the advertising. 2 very healthy pages of recruitment ads, and in fact this was the business model in the early days. It was about recruiting people to the advertising, which attracted readers, because of course we all know that journalists love seeing what's on offer in the media. They still do it, although of course they have to look a little harder to find jobs. And we had not just those 2 pages, but there was another half page, very interestingly, of universities advertising through the media section to recruit students to university media-related courses. Let's go forward now to 2004 very quickly. We've moved to a broadsheet, then 6 pages long. It's getting more newsy. It's creeping into the business section or close to it. It's still a very much separate section, and at 8 pages is distinct from the business section but sits alongside it, and the stories are beginning to get more business-like. As you can see here, a mixture of briefs and news filled the section inside. Still a fair bit of space, but the stories are shorter in length. And a full broadsheet page for advertising in 2004. Still pretty healthy, and these are good journalist jobs, some of which you don't see the likes of so much these days. I think there's an ad for a sub-editor, for example. And then the diary section, which moves into this format, which, as I said, has become the standard format for this page and has remained so to this day, with Errol Simper sharing space with Mark Day and the diarist, who was then Amanda Mead. 2009. Again, the same broadsheet format, looking quite similar to 2004. 8 pages has been reduced to 6. It's even more business-like now and more newsy. Here's the inside page, again a mixture of briefs and news stories. There are less news stories. One of the casualties was the specially designated marketing page. The section is now formally known as Media and Marketing. but by 2009 has lost the dedicated marketing page, although there are marketing stories throughout the section. The once healthy broadsheet page of advertising has now been reduced to just one ad, and tellingly not for one of the mainstream publications but for editor of the independent publication The Monthly. And there it is again, that same format of the diary with Mark Day and Errol Simper's columns in 2009. I'll let you take up the story.
All right, by May this year, the section was only 3 pages long and fully contained within the business section. The second page retained the decade-long format with the diary and the 2 columns by the highly experienced, well-connected Mark Day and the delightfully lugubrious Errol Simper, though if you believe the latter's columns only by the merest thread. The diary was now the domain primarily of the current media editor, Shari Markson. On the front page were 4 news stories, 2 of which were about the business of the media, while one reported the sacking of the New York Times editor Jill Abramson, and the 4th provided the latest developments in the long-running Chaser dog mounting defamation case. On the 3rd and final page there were 6 relatively straightforward news stories about the business of the media. As to the content and the culture of the media section today, it continues to break news about the media industry. For example, Markson's articles on the 10th and 12th of May about internal Fairfax media documents outlining the company's financial difficulties and strategies for dealing with them. But the severely reduced space means, first, that many features that characterised the earlier years are missing. There are no regular letters to the editor and little space for outside opinion pieces. The range of issues and events covered has narrowed. The mainstream media, news media industry is covered, but there is relatively little about new independent startups and about what's happening either in the blogosphere or the Twittersphere. A regular column charting the Twittersphere has been dropped. There is now less reporting on the relationships between the makers of media and the consumers and how this relationship is undergoing radical change. There is relatively little about the many complex issues that media work throws up, such as the changing nature of privacy or the difficulties for journalists of protecting confidential sources in a post-Snowden world of mass surveillance. Similarly, other parts of the media industries, including advertising, public relations, media buying, content marketing and the film industry, are covered patchily. If you wanted to know about what's going on in these areas, you're probably better served today by online websites such as Mumbrella. On the question of even-handed coverage of commercial rivals, the media section has become markedly, sometimes floridly, partisan. In the diary of the first issue of the year, Darren Davidson welcomed readers after the summer break with the words, "Let's keep it clean and above the belt." Now, the weekly diary has long served dollops of media gossip, but even by industry standards, diary in 2014 has not only routinely hit below the belt, but has frequently directed its gaze there. Which federal politician has found new love? Asked an item on the 24th of February about a former minister who was dating his chief of staff after separating from his wife in 2012. If you struggled to see the necessity of that item, you probably shook your head at a 30 June item offering a mock classified listing on the dating app Tinder for rival Financial Review columnist Joe Aston. An even more ham-fisted attempt at humour, assuming that was the goal, was the practice of running attacks on the ABC in the form of mock corrections for errors the newspaper believed the ABC should have made. A media section staff member, Nick Lees, who in 2011 was welcomed as, quote, our amazing new diarist, had left in early 2014 for a role as a corporate affairs spokesman for the ABC, and so was subjected to several items of ridicule and a pillaring of his journalistic practice. Where Lee's sin seemed to be that he had gone to the dark side of public relations, as if that was a first for the industry, more alarming was the treatment of 2 former news executives, Kim Williams, who'd been the company's chief executive in Australia until last August, and Ken Cowley, who devoted most of his working life to news, including 27 years as the local chief executive. Williams was quoted in a Good Weekend profile on the 12th of April, questioning the lack of accountability at senior editorial levels for the commercial losses suffered by the Australian, and was swiftly rebuked in a diary item 2 days later. Quote, "It's worth pointing out that the newspaper has made losses approaching $30 million in only 1 year in its 50-year history, and that happened to coincide with William's brief reign at News Corporation Australia. Given that we now know definitively the extent and frequency of the Australian's financial losses from the newspaper's own historical account that it's been publishing each day leading up to the 15 July anniversary, this item does seem somewhat beside the point." In an interview with the Financial Review on a Saturday the 31st of May, Ken Cowley made several remarks critical of the company in general and of the recent elevation of Lachlan Murdoch to co-chair of News Corp and 21st Century Fox in particular. 2 days later, he was on the front page of The Australian saying that where he'd been quoted saying The Australian was pathetic, what he really meant was that it was the best newspaper in the country, and that his questioning of Lachlan Murdoch's business acumen was not a true reflection of his views. Then followed a second article in the media section criticising Cowley's own business acumen and bolstering Lachlan Murdoch's via lavish tributes from media and business heavyweights James Packer, Gerry Harvey and Michael Miller. What to make of this? Well, seldom has The Australian been accused of pursuing a less is more strategy. If commercial rivals, whether Fairfax Media, Nine's David Gyngell, the ABC or the Mail Online, have been closely scrutinised and their every flaw excoriated, very little similar scrutiny appears to have been directed at News Corporation Australia, and it's hard to recall articles that have been critical of The Australian itself. Rather, embarrassingly extravagant praise has been directed upward at the company's dear leader. In a lengthy comment piece on the 26th of May, the media editor wrote that not only was Rupert Murdoch, and I quote, "the most successful publisher the world has ever seen," but that he has proved himself to be a visionary in a media industry largely populated by lesser executives who show more reservation than courage, more anxiety than insight, and more uncertainty than solutions. In the latest issue of the monthly, Margaret Simons has urged media commentators to stop talking about The Australian because that only feeds what she terms its narcissistic impulses. And she swiftly earned herself schoolyard sarcasm from the cut and paste section and finger wagging from Gerard Henderson in last weekend's newspaper. Now, The Australian's influential role in national affairs continues to merit discussion, but her point surely carries some weight. In the Australian media, has there ever been another media outlet whose editor-in-chief, with a daily leader article and the services of hundreds of journalists at his disposal, feels the need to be quoted so frequently in his own newspaper? A count of the number of times Chris Mitchell's name has been mentioned in The Australian over the past 2 years has been compared to the number of times Andrew Holden, the editor of The Age's name, has been mentioned in his outlet. The former has been mentioned almost 3 times as often as the latter. And at that point, I'll hand over to Andrew on the ABC.
And I'm going to be rapidly editing as I go because we've had a effectively wind up, so I'll cut things short and move through this very quickly. What we've done is look at a couple of case studies of how The Australian has covered issues to address these issues of how it covers its rivals and how it covers itself or its parent company. And one of these case studies is how the Australian's media section has looked at the ABC over years. I'll cut a very long story short by saying that in its early days, the ABC was covered with, I think, scepticism rather than an outright sense of hostility that tends to characterise a lot of the coverage now. There was critical coverage, and in the paper we go through several examples of that critical coverage. And you'll recall that in the late 1990s, the board was being dramatically stacked by the Howard government, and the board then appointed Jonathan Shire as the managing director. This heralded a very turbulent period at The Australian,